For many people, this is Rhode Island architecture, what you'd take your brother-in-law to see if he came to visit. This is where Cornelius Vanderbilt and his guests turned their backs on America and looked out towards Europe, where the inspiration for this mansion came from. This is the Breakers in Newport, and by any standard, it's a great building. But you can't get a good hamburger at the Breakers. This is the modern diner. Built of stainless steel, wood, and formica, its design is American as a fast train to Chicago. Frankie and his cousin Emil stop here for breakfast every morning on their way to the factory. Vinny clinched a deal at the next table to pour 10 yards of concrete. And over there, Mary told her boyfriend she'd love him forever if he'd just give her a bite of his French fries. But the Breakers and the modern diner do have one thing in common. They're both on the National Register of Historic Places, a sort of who's who of American building. And each is a part of what it means to live here. Could I have some vinegar over here, please? I'm David Macaulay. Join us as we discover why the architecture of Rhode Island gives all of us who live here a very special sense of place. When I was growing up in England, like most children, I didn't really think about architecture. I loved building models and forts, but the only test of a real building, a house or a train station or a castle, was what it felt like. Was it fun to be in or wasn't it? Later, when I studied architecture in Rhode Island, I learned why my forts fell down and the real castles didn't. But I never lost a sense of delight in different kinds of buildings from different periods. I stayed on here to write and illustrate books about how they built castles and cathedrals, pyramids and skyscrapers. And as I looked around in my own backyard, I discovered how rich Rhode Island architecture is, how it's given a special character to the state. We could begin anywhere, but let's start in Newport. A fellow named Stephen Mumford built this house himself in 1675, not very long after the colony was founded. Poor Mumford. He lived here for 50 years, but do people call this the Mumford House? No. It's the Wanton Lyman Hazard House, named after 3 later owners. But by any name, it's one of the oldest buildings in Newport, and certainly one of the finest 17th century houses in all of New England. It's a simple plan, 2 rooms to a floor, 1 on either side of the central chimney. In the no-nonsense 17th century, this would have been the kitchen, the heart of the house. There would have been a massive fireplace here, continuously in use for cooking and heating. That's been covered up by this smaller, demure 18th century fireplace and mantel, with its rare Delft tiles from Holland. One of the most fascinating things about this house is that it's been restored so that some of the details from each period have been maintained. It's something like an archaeological dig with the various layers exposed. During this period, buildings were supported by huge wooden posts and beams. Here in this upstairs room, you can see the timber framing. Most of the structure was exposed like this. The huge corner posts, shaped like gun stocks and solidly braced, would have been visible proof of what was holding the house up. This house was never a mansion. It was a simple, straightforward building, erected at the beginning of Newport's rise to success. And unlike the handful of other 17th century Newport houses, it's still here, in virtually its original form. Across the street in 1699, a truly remarkable building was taking shape. the Quaker Meeting House. This was the first meeting house in the colonies, and a building of truly surprising scale and importance. It was to house the first yearly meeting of the new century that this grand house was constructed. It is said that 3,000 Quakers gathered here in that spring of 1700, which is an astonishing number when you consider that the population of Newport was only 9,000. Quakers didn't believe in ministers, and even though the church elders sat up front on benches facing the others, anyone could sit up there if he or she felt inwardly moved to do so. It was meant to be a community of spirit, and so there was no architectural focus in the design, no single center. What else does this building say to us, other than that it is a remarkably astounding solution to the problem of essentially an early convention center? It is, in fact, an astonishing assertion of freedom expressed in architecture. The size of this building, the confidence with which the builders framed the airy central space, the scale and the simplicity of the design and furnishings, all these elements express in a wooden structure what we know from other evidence. The Quakers were more than tolerated here. They were at home. And like Newport, they were thriving. This is what the original building may have looked like. A domestic form, a barn perhaps. It looks simple to us now. But to some of those early Quakers visiting from outside Rhode Island, even this design with its decorative cupola was much too fancy. The Quaker Meeting House and the synagogue that Peter Harrison designed for Newport's Jews later in the 18th century are the rarest of birds. The wonder is not that they're so successful, but that they exist at all. They are architectural embodiments of Rhode Island's tolerance. And here, across town, another religious minority was raising its church. Remember that New England was settled by dissenters, people who broke away from the established church. But Rhode Island was founded by dissenters from the dissenters, like Roger Williams, fanatics of tolerance. So there was even room here for members of the mother church, the Church of England. In 1725, Trinity Church was built. Today, it seems like a symbol of Newport, a postcard image of a New England church. It's worth remembering that the form of this building was not a native plant, but a hothouse flower, imported directly from London. When London was destroyed in the Great Fire of 1666, the architect Christopher Wren was given the job of rebuilding the city's churches, over 60 of them. Trinity Church was almost certainly built from one of Wren's plans, made available to the building committee here by the Church of England as part of its missionary program. Wren's original church would have been made of stone. Trinity Church is a remarkable translation of those forms into wood. The pulpit here has been moved from its normal position on the side wall to the center of the aisle. And what an elegant pulpit it is, in the shape of a wine glass, with two smaller desks reaching in front. The minister is the center of this design, with the sounding board above his head to ensure that not a single word is lost. Presidents, royalty, and Nobel laureates have all worshipped here. But a former tavern keeper, whose pew is right in the back, made it all possible. His name was Richard Mundy. He built this church and was Newport's first architect and builder whose name has come down to us. This church that Richard Mundy built is a strong and graceful statement about order and symmetry, and finally, about authority. Newporters were beginning to see themselves less as colonists than as equal members of the British Empire. Paradoxically, the more they embraced English forms and fashions, the greater their disappointment when Britain treated them shabbily. And they were about to be treated very shabbily indeed. During the first 3 years of the Revolution, the British occupied Newport. They used Trinity Church as a stable, and they burnt 1/3 of the city's houses. The Patriots fled when the British moved in. The Tories fled when the British moved out. And in between, the Quakers drifted off. Newport wouldn't recover for a century. But her bad luck was Providence's good fortune, and the city at the head of the bay was poised to take advantage of it.
At the time of the Revolutionary War, this Providence was really getting underway as one of the great cities. It had been growing in strength during the 18th century. After the Revolutionary War, Newport had lost its hold on the financial character of the state, and Providence had never had that break during the war because it didn't lose its original population. If you were living in Providence in the 18th century, early 18th century, and you looked down on North Main Street, you would have looked to the west and have seen a big cove of water. And across the cove, you would have seen open farmlands. Then along the main street itself, you would see the little houses, the little 1- and 2-story framed houses with steep pitched roofs that made up the first street of Providence. And John Brown and Ives and Carrington and the Russells and the great manufacturing and banking companies were making history for themselves that is still part of the American financial history.
Even by the end of the 18th century, there were no professional architects in Rhode Island. But John Brown didn't have to look far to find someone to build him a new house. His brother Joseph had already built the First Baptist Church on North Main Street and University Hall, here at Brown. Joseph had taste, he had intelligence, and what's more, he owned the English architectural books from which the design was taken. The form of the house was simple, a familiar 18th century plan. 4 rooms around a central staircase. Only the scale had changed.
But what a change. These spacious, high-ceilinged rooms expressed in their size and decorative detail the confidence that Providence's merchant princes felt in this last decade of the 18th century. Traders, bankers, shippers, investors, Brown and his associates were visibly in touch with the larger world. The original wallpaper was printed in Italy, and on the dining room table, the china really was from China. Export ware, brought back from the Orient on one of John Brown's ships. At first, John Brown's house stood in magnificent isolation on Powers Lane, above Benefit Street. But over the next 2 decades, the Brown family could look out their windows and watch the mansions of other wealthy merchants rising around them. They were variations of Brown's basic plan, a 3-story house with a hip roof. The Thomas Point and Ives house just up the hill was built of brick like John Brown's house, but its detailing was less robust, more delicate. On Williams Street, Edward Carrington bought and enlarged this house as a reward for spending 9 lonely but profitable years in China. And the Nightingale house was a more elaborate rendition in wood of the basic plan. These were 4 of the most elegant houses built during the early days of the American Republic, loosely grouped around each other in a circle of friendly mimicry.
Upstairs, here at the John Brown house, a room has been set aside as a kind of memorial to another of the Brown brothers, a man who might not always have been welcome here, Moses Brown.
Years before, he had become a Quaker, and although he took his religion seriously, at one point he sued his brother John for trading in slaves, there was nothing in his faith that prevented a man from turning a profit. He saw that if great fortunes could be made in shipping, great fortunes could be lost there as well.
At the end of the century, Moses had his eye on a new kind of business, one that would change the shape of the way people worked and how they lived.
A Sense of Place will continue.
This was to be the sound of the new century. At first hundreds, then thousands of turning wheels, belts, shuttles, and spindles.
We just fought a revolution, and now we were about to import one. Some say steal it, from England, where a water-powered system had been developed for spinning cotton. For some time, Moses Brown and his Quaker friends here had been struggling to launch an American textile industry. Brown had the money. He even had copies of all the English machines. But what he needed was someone who knew how to operate them.
Enter Samuel Slater, a young, ambitious English immigrant who had spent 7 years learning how to manage a textile business.
Brown's money and Slater's expertise created America's first factory system, just above the Pawtucket Falls, here on the Blackstone River.
In the construction of a textile mill, it was necessary to have a source of water power. They had to build this small dam here, which is above the natural falls in the river. The tower of the mill and its neoclassical cupola were later additions. The tower provided space for a stairway. You could move the stairway out to the tower to save room in the primary manufacturing areas. The bell on the top of the tower was added later as part of the cupola. And it provides a way of calling the workers to come in the morning, perhaps announcing the lunch hour or the end of the day. Windows are very important in a textile mill because they provide natural light for manufacturing. The width of the mill influences how much natural light reaches the machinery and the workers. The critical element of a mill was its power source. In this case, the prime mover was a large water wheel. Water wheels were difficult to construct. They had to be shielded from the elements, and they performed an important role in delivering power into the manufacturing areas.
The sound of the water wheel and the bell. Between those notes, the lives of the mill workers vibrated. Although the work was hard and sometimes dangerous, even the young sons and daughters of the mill owners worked here in the beginning. Later, as more laborers were needed, the owners built housing, schools, and a company store in an attempt to create a closed community whose center was the mill. The way Samuel Slater organized his machines and his workers was the model for 50 years of industrial development. Perhaps one difference by the time this mill at Ashton was built was that the workers were more and more seen to be a part of the machinery, replaceable and interchangeable parts.
Here was the mill, bigger and more imposing than before. If business was the new religion of America, then here was its church and its steeple, and across the street, all of its people and company houses. In the early mill villages like Slatersville and Peacedale, the worker housing was made of wood. Here at Ashton, it's made of brick. These houses on their sturdy granite foundations show just how much the owners put into what today we would call employee relations. You know those highway billboards? If you lived here, you'd be home by now? Well, this was the original.
This was the architecture of the new century, before public transportation. Small living units built as closely as possible to the central factory or mill. In the countryside, the houses were separate. In the booming cities, they were often stacked on top of each other. It made for dependence, certainly, but it also created strong neighborhoods of people whose jobs and backgrounds drew them together. But if this was the future, there were still ambitious Rhode Islanders at the beginning of the century who were struggling to hold on to the past and the old dirty ways of making a living. George DeWolf and his family had been slave traders in Bristol for generations. But George refused to give up the profitable business, even after it had become unpopular, and then illegal. In 1810, he commissioned a house from Bristol's best young architect, Russell Warren. This wedding cake of a house was an ingenious, flamboyant answer to the simple three-story mansions of Providence's merchants. Columns with Corinthian capitals soared 2 stories on the exterior, and Russell added arches and porches and wooden detailing to hide the basically square, familiar shape. Inside, a spiral stairway rises 4 stories through the heart of the house. The rooms around it are surprisingly simple. George DeWolf was a privateer, a slaver, and a speculator. And like his business, his house is all facade. In 1825, his financial empire collapsed almost overnight, and with it, the economy of Bristol. Wealthy men who had depended on DeWolf became day laborers or peddled clams in the street. The banks lost half their capital. The town was suddenly no place for what we would today call a society architect. And so, on the ill wind that blew through Bristol, Russell Warren left for Providence and to a commission that would result in one of America's classic buildings. Strangely enough, a war in the corner of Europe was to have a profound effect on American architecture. In the 1820s, Greece was fighting for her independence, and the eyes of sympathetic Americans were drawn to that country and to publications that described for the first time the classical beauty of ancient Greek architecture. Greek columns, porticos, and pediments suddenly seemed the most appropriate facade for schools and churches, like Manning Chapel at Brown University, or for libraries like the Providence Athenaeum. America, struggling to find its identity as a new republic, had found an architectural style that was both democratic and dramatic. Private houses took the same forms and translated them into wood. Every man's house was no longer his castle, now it was his temple. And it was Russell Warren with his partner James Buckland who built the first Greek Revival building in Providence, and one of the best in America.
The Providence Arcade was a daring experiment in architecture and in commerce. There were arcades and gallerias in Europe, but the idea of a covered street of shops had never been tried here. And Providence wasn't even officially a city in 1828, and it already had its own temple to the gods of retail.
It was an experiment that failed, an idea ahead of its time. The department store was going to be the popular American retail form for the rest of the century. But 150 years later, millions of Americans would spend their Saturdays milling through the arcade's descendants, the artificial streetscape of the modern mall.
Today's malls are usually buildings with insides, but no outsides. You have to drive around for half an hour just to find the entrance. But ever since it was built, entering the arcade has been a part of the drama.
From either Weybosset or Westminster Streets, you entered through a grand portico with huge columns of Johnston granite, the largest in America when they were quarried. Walking through this shadowed, massive porch into the interior, where the space leaps 3 stories to the skylight, is one of the great experiences in Rhode Island architecture. Behind the gray facade, the building has a heart of light. The arcade was a symbol of Providence's new downtown, across Weybosset Neck on the west side of the river. It was boom time in the city, fueled by the profits from the textile industry, some of which went into architecture, and some of which went into the building of canals and railroads. By 1847, the city needed a train station where the tracks converged on Exchange Place, just south of the cove, which still dominated the landscape. It was a difficult project, but the building that rose there would be considered the best early train station in the United States. It was designed by a freshman at Brown University. Thomas Teft, once a poor schoolteacher in Richmond, Rhode Island, was a 21-year-old student and an architect's apprentice when he began designing this building, the Union Depot. From his library of architectural books, he drew together the basic elements of this plan. 2 tall towers from northern Italy, 2 flanking arcades with round arches from Germany, but combined here in a way that was all his own. The long building curving to hug the cove and rising to define and dominate Exchange Place. For an architect at the end of his career, it would have been a remarkable building, but Teft had only begun. During the next 10 years, Teft designed an astonishing variety of domestic and commercial buildings, schoolhouses, libraries, and churches, deftly combining Romanesque and Renaissance motifs. For the mill owner, Robert Lippett, Teft created a Providence townhouse of severe simplicity. In the Tully Bowen house, he was bolder, contrasting the projecting corner blocks with the smooth wall surface. As a guide to the stonecutters, he made drawings for each individual block of the sandstone facade. He loved to explore the decorative possibilities of brick, as he did here in this molding on the Second Universalist Church in Providence. A young man with a fierce ambition and energy, Teft wanted to see firsthand the buildings in England, France, and Germany that he only knew on paper.
While he was on a grand tour of Europe, Teft died at the age of 33, so we'll never know what kinds of buildings this difficult, brilliant artist might have made had he returned. This might be the best place to take our leave of him, at the old South Ferry Baptist Church in Narragansett.
It's a wonderful site, overlooking the bay, and what a sweet building Teft designed for it when he was only 25. It's as if he'd arranged a friendly conversation between different forms and traditions. A Wren church from London, a New England meeting house, and bits of detail from 11th and 12th century Europe. And then he'd enlivened the surface with hexagonal shingles, hand-sawed by one member of the congregation.
Here was Teft's genius, not in mimicking European forms, but in adapting them and translating them into brick and wood in pursuit of an American architecture, an American language of building.
A Sense of Place will continue.
This is Providence City Hall, a symbol of the city's pride and success during the 19th century. In some ways, it's a wonder it ever got built.
In 1845, Providence decided to build itself a city hall. So a committee was appointed, 3 members from the original town across the river and 3 members from the new commercial center, 3 and 3. Providence politics being what it is, it only took 30 years to decide on a site. The new downtown emerged the winner. Samuel Thayer, a Boston architect, won a national competition for the design. What he gave the city was a building inspired by the Second Empire in France, a fashionable form that would have seemed very much at home on the boulevards of Paris.
A French design built on what used to be a tidal marsh on a site formerly occupied by a theater and an opera house. Just the right foundation, some might say, for Providence City Hall, but it's inside that the fun begins.
The building looks severe and imposing from the outside, but the interior is as colorful as a Romanian circus. Look at the scale of the rooms. The council chamber is 3 stories high, with gold stenciling at the top and